Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on best practices for building smart controls. My name is Stella Park, and I'll be your host for today, and our presenter is going to be Jonathan Su. Now, before we jump into the content, I would like to quickly go over the GoToWebinar control panel, especially if this is your first time joining us for one of these. The first thing you'll notice at the top is an arrow, which will allow you to hide and collapse the control panel. By default, everyone's microphone will be on mute, so please use the questions box to ask your questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. If I think it's important for everyone else on the webinar, I'll go ahead and bring it up to Jonathan as well. And with that, we're going to start off with a quick poll. The first question we would like for you to answer is if you are a current iForm Builder user. This helps us get an idea of who we all have on the call today. All right, it looks like everyone has answered. Oh wait, let's wait a few more minutes or seconds. Okay. And as some of these votes are coming in, it looks like we do have a few current users. Actually, a majority of you guys are current users, and we do have a few that are just checking things out. So welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'll go ahead and close out that poll. And we also have another poll asking if you have ever done any of the following. So if everyone could go ahead and respond to that as well, that would be wonderful. It is a multi-select, so please choose all answers that pertain to you. And once all the answers come in, I will go ahead and show everyone the results so we can gauge the experience level that we have. All right, let's give it a few more seconds here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll. And here are the results. Looks like a good amount of you have built a form, built subforms, and smart controls and page level JavaScript. So now I'll go ahead and hand over the presentation to Jonathan.
Thanks, Stella, and good afternoon, everybody, for joining. Thank you, I appreciate it. My name is Jonathan Su, as Stella said, and I will be the presenter for today. We have a really good webinar for you all prepared. We're going to be going through a lot of the basics and fundamentals of building out your smart controls, whether you are a new form builder or you're an experienced form builder coming back for a refresher. One of the neat things about the iForm Builder platform is that it's so versatile in the way it allows you to write your smart controls that even internally, we find ourselves continually revising what we consider best practices and the proper way to build certain forms and to use certain techniques. So what I wanted to do today was I've compiled a list of some of the more top of mind rules that we've been building out and some of the newest features that we've released as well. And this is going to be a nice little presentation for everybody. We do have a form package prepared, so we'll be able to distribute that after the webinar, so you'll have a working example of everything we go through. And at any point, as Stella mentioned earlier, if you have any questions or if I'm moving too fast, please ask a question in chat or just let her know to stop me, and we'll be sure to go back, double back, and clear up any confusion that we have. So as you can see on the screen for the agenda, we're going to start with talking through how app data is stored inside of the iForm application. And then in tandem with that, we're going to talk about a pretty hot button topic that we've seen a lot of traction on lately, which is how to avoid data caching. I wanted to talk through how that process works a little bit, and we actually have some new best practices around how to mitigate having values from previous records show up in your newly opened forms. After that, we're going to do a deep dive into referencing subform elements. This is a topic that most users need because of the structure of your forms as in how they're designed, but it can be a little bit tricky if you don't have a lot of experience with it. Fortunately, I have a nice little technique in how to do this where you can follow a few steps and it's going to be very easy to reproduce. And then we're going to round things out looking at some page level JavaScript, and then finally looking at our newest element, the lookup element, but specifically how to set up filters within that element, because it's a little different than how we've done things in the past. So beginning with how app data is stored on the device and then how we're going to avoid data caching issues, the first thing I wanted to do was go through some basic terminology to make sure that we're all on the same page. So inside of your app, all of the different values that are stored are going to be stored in what are called variables. And so a variable is just simply a placeholder where whatever you type in or whatever you enter or select is going to be stored with that name as an identifier. So imagine if you build a form and you add a text element into it, and we name that text element attendees. Then what that means is you're going to have an attendee variable. Whenever you create a record also on the app, the important thing to know is that there's also a second variable that's going to be the name of the form. Inside that variable, you will have nested values, which are going to be the different elements within it. Now that's a little bit confusing. If you take a look at the next line inside of the slide here, for that attendee field, that text element that we created, inside of the app's memory, you're going to have a variable that's called attendee, but you'll also have one that's called smartcontrols.attendee. Now that's making the assumption that the form's name is smart controls with an underscore in between. Now this is really important because if we continue to add fields to our form, let's say we add a value for age, a number element, then you're going to now have two variables, attendee and age, as well as two properties nested inside of smart controls for attendee and age. And the reason this is important is because even though there are two variables here for attendee or two variables for age, only one of those actually represents the true value of the record that you are inside of. And that's going to be the ones that are nested under smart controls. So if we look at how this is going to behave, let's say we go ahead and fill out a record and we put in the name for attendee and we put in a value for age. Whatever we type into the form is going to be stored in both places. So you'll see here, my name Jonathan and then age 35 is stored in attendee and age, as well as, and this should actually say smart controls attendee.age. Now the tricky thing is after you submit that record, you'll notice that my forms variables are cleared out. However, the shared variables without the form name are not cleared. They retain their values. So if we jump over here to the device, I can show you what that looks like. So I have this form that I've created for the purposes of the webinar, and we have a text element at the top named attendee. Inside of here, if we go ahead and type in a name and submit it, we have those values populating to both read-only elements underneath. Now, the second element, the middle one, uses just the data column name attendee as our dynamic value. The bottom one uses the full form path, smartcontrols.attendee. Both work fine for now, but if I submit this record and I open up a new one, we'll see the behavior I just talked about. The field that has only the data column name retains its value, what we've referred to in the past as caching, whereas the full form path does not. Now, if I were to update this, add a new value, you'll notice that everything goes back to how it should be. But if this field is hidden or anything like that happens, or the data collector just misses it and doesn't notice, you may run into scenarios where the data is mismatched, and that's what we want to avoid. So as a result, our newest best practice here is that in order to guarantee smart controls are referencing the current record's value, you always want to use the full form path. So that means you're always going to start with the form's name, followed with a period or a dot, and then the data column name afterwards. Now, the behavior we just talked through earlier with the parent level values for a text element and a number element also apply to subforms, and we can see that behavior as well. So if I look here in the description, if I have a subform with a number element called score, and I type in the number 9, it would save in the first record. Then when I open up the field again, score would be cached. And then I'll show you what that looks like on the device itself. All right, so if I type in the number 9, you'll see that I'm using just the data column name score as my dynamic value. Press done. If I open up a next record, you'll see that number is still there. It retains its value because that value, that variable, is just kind of free floating is the way I like to describe it. It's not tied directly to the record. So So if I enter in a new number here, we'll see it updates properly because now I've updated that free floating variable. And if I go all the way back, we'll go up to the parent record and we'll come back here. Now, an interesting behavior that we've found with the app is that those free floating variables without the form name prepended to it are actually shared across the entirety of the app. So you may even have scenarios where you have two forms with the same data column name, and you would have a value that you entered in on form 1 carry over to form 2 if the data column names match and if you don't specify the form name in the path. So again, just going back to that new best practice, I want to reiterate, make sure that you always use a full form path when you are building out your smart controls. That's how you're going to guarantee that you're not going to have a cached value. Previously, what we've done is we've put a lot of effort into trying to find ways to clear out the cached values. I'm sure a lot of you who have built forms are familiar with setting text fields to an empty string or setting a number element to 0, something like that. But what we found is to have more reproducible results, using the full form path to make sure you specify the appropriate space in memory has been a lot more consistent. And so we recommend everybody do that moving forward. Stella, I want to check in real quickly before we move on to the next section. Are there any questions about this that have come up?
It looks like there are no questions for now, so everyone's on the same page.
All right, very cool. So let's move forward then. The next topic we're going to go through is referencing subform elements. Now, I know that this is a topic that can get very, very complicated for users, especially if you are, if you haven't practiced with this, or maybe you're coming through chat and you're trying to get some help right away. It's hard to solve this kind of on the fly. And so what I wanted to do was make sure we take a step back and talk about this more from a training perspective, and then you'll be able to go and take the techniques you learned during this webinar and apply them to your own production forms. To start things off, I'd like to begin with a poll. And this is a simple poll, just kind of asking everybody how complex their form structures are. This is something that we're always interested in. A lot of groups may have 0 subforms. You might just have flat forms, but then we have a lot of groups who come to us specifically because of our ability to have these deep, complicated data structures. So as the votes are coming in, we'll wait a little bit and then we'll close this poll out. Okay, a little bit longer as these votes trickle in. And I do want to share these votes, or the answers, the responses to this poll. I actually think they're very interesting. I'm going to give this another second or two here. A couple of votes remaining. All right, let me go ahead and close this out and share the results. So it looks like most people have, well, not the majority, but the largest proportion have 1 to 2 subforms, which I think it was expected. It also looks like we have a good number of groups who have very complicated forms, 5+ subforms. Now, I didn't specify, that could be like 5 subforms on one parent level, or it could even be 5 forms nested within one another. I didn't want to be overly specific about this question, but either way, you're going to be working with subforms on a regular basis. And so I think that this next topic will be very pertinent to everybody. Now, for those of you who have not filled out subforms before, actually, I have to close this one second. I had the results. For those of you who have not used subforms in the past, I wanted to do a brief overview of them to begin with, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So a subform is going to be a second form that you reference as an element on a top level or on a parent form. You'll hear the word parent very frequently. You also hear the word child very frequently. And you can think of the parent as the top level form. The child is going to be the form that's nested underneath it, so the subform. Now, once you have a subform, the records within it are organized as a list. And so it's very important because a list is going to have 2 things to it. It's going to have an order, and it's always going to have an identifier for that order, the place in line. Now, iForm Builder is built on top of using JavaScript for a lot of the smart controls. So I also want to make sure that we use the appropriate language for JavaScript. So your subform is going to be referred to as an array of objects, where each record is an object, and the array is your list. Now within your array or your subform list, every record is going to have a position, which is called an index. That index is going to be a whole number starting at 0 and working its way up. So even if you have a single record in your subform, maybe you have a single paging subform, or you have a multi-paging subform where you only fill out one record, you still have a position in line that's important to understand. And the analogy I always use is if you're at a grocery store and you are the only person in line, you're still technically in line. So you will always have an index. You will always need to refer to it when you're working with your subforms. Now, there's a couple of rules that we can use to frame how your indexes are going to be structured. Because we know that they always start at 0, and because we know they're always whole numbers counting upwards, the two things we can keep in mind are first, that the initial record in an array is always going to have an index of 0. And then the second key note to take away here is that the last record in the array is always going to have an index that is equal to the length of the array minus 1. So let's say I have a subform where I fill out 5 records. The first record will always have an index of 0, and that last record is going to have an index where it's equal to the length of 5 minus 1, so 4. And then all the numbers in between are for all of the other subform records. Now, there's two ways to specify an index in your smart controls inside of iForm. The first way you're going to be able to do this is if you hard code the actual position in line. So for example, inside of my square brackets, I can put a 0 there. And what that's going to do is it's always going to refer to the first record in my subform. Now, if you have a single paging subform or your use case dictates that you always want to grab the first record inside of that subform, then putting the number 0 there is the fastest way to do this. It's the easiest way and is going to be the shortest reference possible. But sometimes you're going to have a multi-paging subform, or you may need to reference a value within the middle of the subform or even at the end, and so you can't hard code that number. You need it to be dynamic. In those cases, we want to use the .index property of the subform element. And so what we're going to do here is, if you notice in my screenshots, instead of putting a number 0 here, I'm going to reference .index of my subform named attendees. And what this is going to do is it's effectively going to say my current index. And so if I'm in the first record, that value would be 0. If I'm in the second record, that value would be 1. But it is what's called a relative reference. Now this method is a little bit longer, but it's the only way to get those dynamic results that you need for calculations and for different smart controls, or if you need to show and hide a field with a condition value. Now, for those of you who responded, you have 5+ forms or even 2+ subforms, or 3 to 4. This method can get very, very overwhelming very quickly, because you're going to need to manage multiple sets of indices, and you have to make sure you manage the correct data column names as well. And so for this, I have a technique that I want to share with everybody. It's a 4-step process. And this is the way I always build my forms out. And honestly, it requires almost no mental energy, which is the nice thing about it. You can just follow the steps and have reproducible results. So we're going to look at grandchild forms, because this is where you're going to be able to see the process repeated. And so our grandchild form is going to have 2 levels. You have a parent, a child, and then inside that subform, you have another subform. So a nested a 3rd time. The strategy, as I said before, is in 4 different steps, as you see on the screen. And the first step is we're going to write out the entire reference with empty square brackets. And so what I have here is the name of my subform, or I'm sorry, the name of my parent form, the name of my subform element, empty square brackets, the name of my nested subform element, empty square brackets, and then finally the name of the element inside of the grandchild form. So think of this as your template. We're not putting all of the different information in here yet. We're just building our structure so that we can work backwards and fill it in afterwards. Now the second step is going to be to copy everything up to your first set of square brackets, and then you're going to paste it inside of them. So I have this highlighted in orange right here, but I would basically take this and copy it, and then I would paste it inside the square brackets afterwards. So that's my step 2. From here, the step 3 is we're going to add the .index property. So after I have attendees here, I type .index, and I've actually at this point completed my reference to this email's element. Now, because we have a grandchild form, we need to repeat this process for the next subform. Again, I'm going to highlight all the text leading up to the square brackets. Now notice this includes the previous set of square brackets. That's intentional. After I copy that, I'm going to go ahead and paste it inside of the next set of square brackets. And then finally, I will add my .index afterwards. And at this point here, this entire reference I have highlighted is going to reference the current position of the address field inside of my grandchild form. And so it's just a matter of rinse and repeat. If you have a 4th layer, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to highlight all the way up until the next set of square brackets, copy, paste, add the .index afterwards. Now to show you what this all looks like on the form, we're going to head back over to my tablet. And I have an example of these grandchild references here. Now let me show you what this looks like first. After that, I'm going to open up the form builder and we're going to deconstruct how these references were built. So inside of attendees, I'm going to go to email addresses. I'm going to type in an email address here. Now we're going to make up a couple of email addresses just to keep this a little bit quicker. I'll do one email address there and a second email address. We'll start here. I'm going to back up. I'm going to click on done. And you'll notice here, I have 2 references for the first email address that I wrote and then the last email address that I wrote. So let's go ahead and jump into the form builder and see how that looks. So down here, as I open up my subform example, here's my first email address. I'm going to go to the dynamic value, which is the smart control responsible for inputting the actual value into the element. I begin with the form's name, smart controls, and we can verify that looking down here on the footer of the form builder. This is a really convenient spot to grab this anytime you need to build your smart controls. I always highlight this, do a copy and paste into my smart control areas. So I begin with the form name dot attendees, which is my subform's data column name. This is an important distinction. We don't want to use the actual form name. We want to use the subform data column name here. After that, I did a 0 because I want the very first record of my child form. Inside of that, email's 0 again because I want the very first grandchild record. And then email is the name of my text element here in my grandchild form. And just for reference, this is the middle form, the child form. And then this is my parent form again. Now to grab the last email address, I took this, and this was the process I went through actually. I literally copied this, pasted it in the one below, and I modified the 0. So what I have here is this. Instead of putting a 0 inside the square brackets, I have this smart control code here. So I'm going to say I want the length of the attendee subform minus 1. Referring back to that rule I mentioned earlier, where we know that the latest record in our subform is going to be the length minus 1. And I repeat that process, for my grandchild form. Same thing, inside the square brackets, I have all of this. So I take the length of the child minus 1, and then the length of the grandchild minus 1. And so this is again, it can get a little tricky because you have brackets inside of brackets, but if you follow the steps that I outlined earlier, you'll be able to manage this with no problem at all. And in fact, what I want to do next is go through the process of building this out. So we're going to do a little bit of form building here. So what I want to do is I want to add a read-only underneath this email element, or I'm sorry, this text element named email. And I want it to reference whatever I just typed in here. So I'm going to add a read-only element. And I'm going to call this email address read only. Okay. Now let's follow the steps that I outlined to do our smart controls here. The very first thing we're going to do is type out our structure. So I know that it starts with the form name. So smart controls. Next, I'm going to take the subforms data column name of attendees, add square brackets. I'm going to leave them there. I'm just setting up my structure. Inside of attendees, I have a new subform element called emails. So I'm going to take this field, copy and paste, add my square brackets, and then finally, I'm going to take my data column name inside of the grandchild level form. I will paste it here. So this is my structure, form name dot subform element, square brackets, dot subform element, square brackets, dot element inside of my grandchild level form. So now let's start from the front. Let's take our cursor and copy everything up until the square brackets. We will paste it. And then our third step, we're going to add dot index. That's our first reference. We're going to go to the next set of square brackets, highlight everything preceding it, paste, dot, index. Now we're going to save this. And then we will hop over to the device. I'm going to go ahead and sync this. And while I sync this, Stella, are there any questions in the chat that have come up?
Yes, there's actually two.
Okay.
One of them is if they can get the reference code, the steps that you just talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely. So again, this form package that I'm using to go through the webinar is going to be sent to everybody, so you'll be able to import it into your own environment. Additionally, these slides will be made available as well with the steps outlined on how to do everything.
Okay, and then we also have another question about the smart control field limits. Has it been expanded at all?
Yeah, good question. So if you look at this slide here, right, you'll notice that this reference is to a single data point, and it can get pretty long already. If I go back to my form builder, you'll notice again, this is just a single reference. Now, previously, the smart control limit was 500 characters. Even before that, it was actually 300. But acknowledging that in order for customers to be able to reference these fields appropriately, the references can become exceedingly long, we've actually increased that limit to 2,000 characters now. So you shouldn't have any problems being able to fit your smart controls inside of the fields. In the past, I know that I've received feedback from groups who will do things like intentionally shortening or generalizing the data column names just for the purpose of being able to fit them inside of these fields. That's no longer necessary. We want to make sure that you name your elements appropriately so that they make sense to you as the form builder and also your users and anybody digesting the data. And as a result, the smart control limits have been increased so that you shouldn't have any problems there. Any other questions, Stella?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, so let's go back to the form here now that I've synced my device. And we'll take a look at our new field. We'll go into email addresses. You'll see our read only is here. And just to test it out, let's add our email address. And we're appropriately referencing the previous field. We'll do one more record. You'll notice that there's no caching here. And again, it's because we're referencing directly into the record structure as opposed to just using like the free floating variable named email. We can do another one here, test2 at test.com. And we'll back up all the way. And you'll see that these fields have been updated as well. Okay. All right. Moving on to our fourth topic now. This is one that I enjoy quite a bit actually, because we use page-level JavaScript to solve our most complex form building challenges. And it's really an area where page-level JavaScript is going to open up what is possible for a lot of form builders, but at the same time, it could be very overwhelming if you haven't used it before. And referencing the previous poll, it looks like we're about split in the audience. Half of us have used page level JavaScript in the past, half of us have not. And so what I wanted to do, I kind of anticipated this would be the case. I wanted to talk through page level JavaScript from a planning level, not so much like this is the JavaScript code you want to write to do whatever you're going to be doing, but more about organizing your thoughts and how you want to plan out your page level JavaScript. Now, for the uninitiated, page level JavaScript, which we abbreviate a lot of the time as PLJS, is going to allow your form builders to define a function. And that function is going to be able to be used anywhere within the form. Now, what's a function? A function is going to be a sequence of commands. Think of it as steps or like a task list that is going to be executed anytime you reference it by its name. And so that, going back and inferring what I just said and unpacking it, your function is going to have a name, it's going to have a definition, and that anytime you refer to that function via its name, that definition is going to be executed. Now, most of the time, whenever you have a function, it's going to need some information in order to perform its definition. Those values that it needs are called inputs. And so with your function, you will have one or many inputs into the function. It's going to do whatever you define and whatever you set it to do. And generally speaking, it's also going to have an output. What we call a return is the appropriate word to use in JavaScript. So again, your function, think of it almost like a black box. Inputs go in, the function's definition executes, and then you have an export that is returned out of the function. Now, when you want to use page level JavaScript, you want to use it anytime you have like a similar calculation that's going to be performed multiple places inside of your form, or if you have a really complicated sequence of steps that won't fit inside of a smart control field, that's another prime opportunity to use page level JavaScript. Now, what I have prepared for us today is one example of page level JavaScript for one of the most common use cases that we see, especially newer form builders want to do, which is a very simple concatenation of a first, middle, and last name. So just to show you how this looks, I'm going to go ahead and enter in values for all three fields. Okay. And underneath, inside of this read-only field called full name, that's where I have my function defined. And what it's going to do is it's going to take those three fields and it's going to construct and then print out the full name. So let's take a look under the hood and see how this page level function is written. The first thing I want to do is highlight, actually before I even do that, let's go through these three text fields. Very simply, they're all named as their label looks, but just all lowercase with an underscore because they have to be database friendly. So first name, middle name, last name. Now inside of my read only, which is called full name, here's my dynamic value. And we'll return to this in a second, but I also want to show you the page level function, which is right here. Now to get to that page level function, let me go back for a second. There's an icon in the upper right corner of your form builder, which are curly braces. And so by clicking on this, it's going to open the page level JavaScript editor, which is right here. Now taking a look at line number 2, which is the first line of my function, there's 3 things that I want to talk through. Actually 4 things. The first one is this keyword function. This is the command inside of JavaScript to let the application know that we're defining a function. Next, we have our name. So this is whatever I decide I want the function to be named. In this case, I called it make full name. And then inside of my parentheses, I have my inputs. So I'm going to require 3 fields, first, middle, and last. And then the 4th thing I wanted to highlight was this curly brace. This is paired with this closing curly brace. And those are just going to define the start and end of our function. So these are like the container or like the boundaries. Now, if you were paying close attention, you may notice that these names, first, middle, and last, are different than my data column names here. First name, middle name, and last name. I did that intentionally to highlight an important point here. When you have a function and you have your inputs come in, you're able to take those values and name them something that is local to the function. So what that means is these variables, first, middle, and last, only exist within the context of my function. They don't exist outside of it. Now, why is this important? This is important for two reasons. First of all, you're able to name your variable something a little bit shorter perhaps, or a little bit easier to reference inside of your function. The second reason it's important is because this allows you to take this function and use it in multiple different places. If you remember earlier when I said that you want to use a page level JavaScript function, if you have a similar set of steps or a similar formula multiple times in your form, well, if these had to match with the outside value or the outside identifier, you wouldn't be able to use this in a reproducible manner. Because you have what's called a local scope, or you have a local variable within your function, you can use this with multiple values outside of it. They don't need to match. Now going back to the name of my function, make full name, we can now take a look at my dynamic value here. And you'll see that I reference or invoke the function by calling it make full name. And inside of my parentheses, I'm going to list the three values that I have passed to it. So you'll notice here I have smartcontrols.firstName, smartcontrols.middlename, and finally smartcontrols.lastName. And again, we're going to use that best practice. We're always going to reference the full form path when possible to make sure that we don't have any data caching issues. Now, inside of my function, I'm going to go over this pretty quickly because the purpose of this webinar is not to take a deep dive into JavaScript itself. But effectively, what this function is going to do is it's going to create an array. And for each one of these values, it's going to add the array if there's something in there to be added. At the end, it's going to join them all with a blank space, and then it's going to return that value. If nothing was entered, so basically if first, middle, and last have no value to them, it's just going to return an empty string. So you always get something back from the function either way. Returning to my form, we can actually see this in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to discard this and start a new record for us. So what happens if the person only has a first name and a last name? They don't have a middle name. If you've written this function before, I'm sure you can anticipate what may have happened in the past, which is you may have had two spaces in between first and last name. But because of the way we wrote this, since middle name doesn't have a value, we're actually going to skip it inside of the JavaScript, which is pretty neat. And it's only going to have a single space in between my first and last name. Now, if we want to take this another step further, let's say we don't even have a first name. I don't know how it's possible to have a middle name without a first name, since it's by definition not in the middle, but we'll write it out anyways. Right? You'll notice that it still maintains the appropriate spacing. So if you've written this function in the past, feel free to take this form package, take the page level JavaScript function, copy and paste it into your own page level JavaScript code for your form, and use it in your own forms. That was the entire reason for us using this example to put inside of the webinar, and hopefully you will have good results with it. Stella, checking in one more time. Any questions from the audience?
So there was one regarding the previous topic. Are there any limitations to the amount of grandchild forms you can add?
When you say the amount of grandchild forms, do you mean like forms nested within one another?
Yes.
Okay. So there is actually a limit. So there's two limits. The first one is functionally, if your form gets really, really deep and your form names are not 2 letters long, you may run into the smart control limit, which we talked about earlier. The more serious limit is actually in terms of the level of depth, and that's specifically a software limitation. You can't go lower or more than 10 layers deep. And so, a form inside a form inside a form inside a form, total 10 levels is the maximum you can go. Any further than that, and you're going to start running into problems, specifically running out of memory inside the application.
Okay, that's it for now.
Okay, cool. So to round out the page level JavaScript section, I had a real quick poll here. This is a multi-select, just like one of the earlier polls, but I just wanted to get a sense from the audience, when you're working with page level JavaScript, where you have the most trouble. And what this is really going to indicate to us is kind of where you are in terms of your experience working with page level JavaScript. Okay, we'll wait a little bit for these responses to come in. A couple more seconds, and then we will move on to our final topic. Let's go ahead and close this poll out. And just to go ahead and share the results. It looks like the majority of people actually have trouble knowing what JavaScript commands are available. And I fully empathize with you. I'm in the same boat quite often, where none of us memorize everything that you can write inside of JavaScript. And so when it comes to knowing what you can put inside your page level, it can be challenging just to know what tools you have at your disposal. I would recommend a couple different things. The first thing is I would definitely recommend searching through our Customer Success Center for help articles and tutorials on some of the most common page level JavaScript functions that we experience and that we've answered in the past. That's always a good reference to use. The second thing is, quite honestly, I would just go on Google and search for the general JavaScript things that you're trying to do. I used the word concatenation earlier. That is a programming term for combining two strings. But as you search through the help desk, as you go through your own challenges when it comes to form building, what's actually going to end up happening is you're going to realize you start to pick up these programming skills and techniques. And before you know it, actually, you may be pretty well versed in writing short JavaScript statements, which is pretty awesome. We've gotten that feedback from a lot of people. But when it comes to knowing what commands are available, don't think you have to memorize everything. Just know where to look, right? Whether that's the Customer Success Center or just jumping on Google and searching for certain terms and certain techniques. When it comes to organizing your thoughts on how to plan out a function, I would refer back to this right here, where a function is a sequence of commands with inputs and outputs. So if you think about that and you define what each one of those things is going to be, you start from the end. What's my output? What am I trying to get out of this function? And then you say, what items do I need? What pieces of information do I need to make that happen? That's your inputs. And then finally, once you have your inputs, once you have your output that you are expecting, then what you have to do in the middle is going to come to clarity a lot faster. And then finally, with troubleshooting user feedback, this one is a tough one too. My recommendation here, as you write your functions, would certainly be to write your functions in smaller steps. Don't try to write out a 100-line, super long page level function and just cross your fingers and hope it works the first time. Take it one step at a time, and that's how people actually write, applications and programming as well. Is they don't bite off everything in one big bite. They do it one step at a time, and as they go through each step, they verify to make sure that they are where they expect to be at that stage. Before we hit the last topic, which is the lookup element filter, Stella, I wanted to check in one last time to see if there are any other questions.
So there is actually a really great question. It's not related to smart control, but more best practices.
Sure.
So originally there is a limit to each form to 100 fields. Is that still the case?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one. There is technically not a hard limit, at least that I know of, as far as how many elements you can have on a form. The reason is different element types, different data types are going to have different storage capacities when it comes to the database that's underneath or behind the scenes of every form. And so because there's a variable size and memory restriction there, it's hard for us to say this is the exact number of elements you can have on a form, because it's not necessarily true. If you have a data type that has a very small memory footprint, you can put a lot of them on a form, as opposed to having, like, for example, a text area, which has a very large data footprint, you can't have as many of them. So we use the number 100 as a guiding reference. We would recommend you not to go above 100. If you have 101, 102, you'll be okay in all honesty. But the main thing is to test out first, right? Always test your forms. But then also keep in mind one of the other points of feedback we've received in the past is that if you start to get forms that are really, really long, 100, 150 elements, even though it works and even though it can be saved, the end users honestly suffer a lot of the time from having a form that long. They may lose their place in the form, or they may miss fields by accident as they're scrolling through it. So there's also a component of usability there, making sure you build the form for the user. And so for those two reasons involved, I would say to keep to that 100 element limit and try not to exceed it if at all possible. Anything else?
That's all the questions for now.
Okay, thanks. All right, so our final topic here is on writing the lookup filter logic. Now I wanted to use this as a topic in the webinar because the lookup element is our newest element. It was the newest element we've added to the form builder. And it's going to be pretty cool because we have some new mechanisms for building it out inside of the form builder that I wanted to highlight today. Now, before we get into the actual building of the lookup element, let's talk about what it is. The lookup element is going to function very similarly to the smart table search that you may be familiar with from previous forms that you've built. Now, your smart table search is effectively going to allow you to have a form that functions as what we call it like a local database or a reference table, and you can choose rows from that table to pre-populate values in your form. Common use cases here are like an employee table, or we've seen reference tables for inventory or for assets are really common use cases for smart table search, and as a result also for the lookup element. Now previously with the smart table search, you'd have a single lookup field, and then from there you'd be able to grab the values. We'd found some limitations with that for our customers who have more complex use cases. And so we've built the lookup element to accommodate a lot of those. One of the biggest points of feedback we received from the smart table search was the need to be able to filter the lookup records. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Now, in order to do that, we're going to apply what's called a dynamic attribute to our lookup element. Dynamic attributes are an extensible way for us to add new configurations on a per element basis, which is pretty cool. And so the lookup element will have, for example, this filter dynamic attribute, whereas another element like a text element may not have that. And so we're going to go through the process of adding your dynamic attribute, setting it up. But before we do that, let's take a look at the form on the device. So I have this element at the very bottom called company lookup. I'm just going to open it up. And this is what the lookup element this is how it's displayed on the device. Now, for a smart table search, you are probably familiar with just a single field that would be on each row. If you've used a smart table search from the very beginning, you may even remember when it was a text entry where you had to type in the value and match it to the DB. Now what we have here is the ability to show multiple columns inside of that lookup table. You can also organize these as you want, so you can change the order of them. But you can have up to 5 fields on here, and that's primarily because of the display. Once you choose one of them, it's going to show you the different values you have inside of the element itself, and you're able to reference them, which we're not going to cover today in this webinar, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like on the device itself. So now in order to filter this, what we're going to do is jump back over here to the form builder, and we're going to add a filter so that it's only going to show the companies that are inside the United States. Now, this is an opportunity for us not only to highlight the lookup element, but also an opportunity for us to highlight some of the guided tutorials that we've been working really hard on inside of the form builder. And so to do this, I'm not going to go through the steps myself without any guidance. I'm going to click on tutorials on the left-hand side, and I'm going to search here for a lookup filter. And you'll see it's it's the top value here actually. So we're going to click on this. And what's neat about this is it's going to guide us through the process of adding in the dynamic attribute that we want. So it says click on your lookup element, which is the first thing we're going to do. And then it's going to ask me to click on the dynamic attributes option. Now, Inside of the form builder, I just want to show you all where this is. This is right underneath the common properties inside of element properties. At the bottom, there's a drop-down for dynamic attributes. If you're in an element that does not have any dynamic attributes, you won't see this field, but otherwise you can click on the drop-down to see what is applicable to that element. We're going to choose filter as the tutorial asks us to do. And then now you'll see that we have a nice interface here to build out the criteria. Now, so far, everything we've done in the form builder previously has been inside the Smart Controls panel, which you can see peeking out of the bottom of my screen. But here for the filter logic, we've actually built a UI that's going to help guide you through this process. So I want to set up my expression. I want the country from the lookup table to be equal to, and then the value that I want to put in here is United States. Okay. Now, a real quick note about the value I'm entering here. I have double quotes at the end and the beginning of this. That's because this is a string, and so this is a text value. Those double quotes are important. Without the double quotes, what it would do is it would reference a value or an element inside the form. So just like your normal smart controls, where you're able to use a data column name, you can do that inside this field value as well. But for now, we're going to just hard code a static value. I want it to be equal to the United States. I'm going to click on confirm. Now that I'm done, I'm going to click on next, and then I'm going to save. And you'll notice here, there's just a real quick note, because this element and this feature is relatively new, these are the minimum requirements on the device. If you're on iOS, you have to be on app version 8.36 or higher. For Android, 8.12 or higher. Okay, I'm going to close this out. And then I already saved, so let me go back to my device. I'm going to discard this. I'm going to sync. And we'll take a look at the updated lookup element. Okay. As I open this, scroll down to company lookup, and you'll notice that my table only has the countries which have the value of United States listed in them. I can make a choice from here if I'd like to. Okay. Stella, any questions from the audience regarding the lookup element or anything really?
Yes, there's actually two questions about the lookup. One, some of the users are not able to see the tutorial sidebar, and if you have to be a company admin to assign these tutorials. So I can actually go ahead and answer this one. First off, if you are on a dedicated database and you're a server admin, you can get this enabled under the server info tab under extensions. If you do not see the WalkMe extension or you don't have a dedicated database, then reach out to customer support or your customer success manager, and we can go ahead and get that enabled for you. As for assigning tutorials, everyone has the same access to all of the tutorials available right now.
Okay, cool. Thanks for taking that one, Stella.
You're welcome.
All right. Real quick note about the lookup element. This is the last thing I want to mention regarding it. The filter that we built during the webinar today was a very, very basic filter. It was just a single condition to check for something to be equal. You are able to build more complex expressions. So if I were to go back to the form builder, if I hover over my expression, you'll notice there's a button called group. And doing this is going to allow you to build these complex filter logics where you have multiple criteria. So let's say we do something like this, right? Equal to. Okay. And these individual conditions are going to be combined with a logical operator, either and or the logical operator or. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about was the differences here. If I have and selected, what that means is in order for the row to be shown, both conditions have to be true. The country has to be equal to United States and the company has to be equal to Zarian. If we have or, only one of them has to be true. The country has to be equal to United States or the company has to be equal to Zarian, and then it would show. So you can imagine if we add more conditions to our filter, this can grow. Like I can add additional ones here as well. But again, just always make sure you test it out and make sure it works for you as you would expect. All right. As we come to the top of the hour and we round out this webinar, I did want to ask one last poll, and this is for us to garner a little feedback regarding the lookup element. This is a multi-select, just like the two other polls previously. And we just want to see how everybody feels about the lookup element. If you've used it, if you're interested about using it, or if it just doesn't meet your needs at this time. As these votes are coming in, just like always, we're going to wait a little bit. And while we're actually having everybody vote, Stella, are there any final questions from the audience?
Yes, I do actually have two. One is regarding dynamic. Is there a dynamic feature that allows you to order the data columns from least to most, etc.?
Let's see. Order the data columns from least to most. Oh, like the values inside of it?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, yeah, so you can do that. One of the other dynamic attributes for the lookup element is called sorting. And so you'll be able to choose a data column, and then you'll be able to choose ascending or descending.
Okay, great. And then another question is, can you filter off of another field in the form?
Yes, and so I think I covered that a little bit, but just to be super explicit about that, you are able to use in that filter logic other elements inside that form. You're also able to use built-in functions like iFormBuilder.username, iFormBuilder.email, things like that, so that your filter criteria is based on a value inside of the form.
Okay, awesome. That's all the questions for now.
All right. Let's go ahead and close this poll out. I'm going to share the results real quickly here. It looks like a lot of people are interested in converting their old smart table search elements, which is awesome. I mean, that was really the spirit in which we went about building this element. If you have any questions about it, kind of relating to the other option here, or you want a little bit of guidance, absolutely make sure to reach out to our team, whether that is through support or to your specific customer success manager, and we'll help you through that process. But we really hope that you're able to add the lookup element to your forms and improve the experience for your end users. With all that being said, that is everything that I had to present to everyone today. Just to recap, at the end of this webinar, you're going to have a quick survey. Is that right, Stella, that everybody's going to receive, and we would appreciate if you fill that out?
Yes, that is correct. It will pop up right after you close out of the webinar. So we are always looking to improve our experience in the webinar, so please fill that out if you can.
Okay. Anything else, Stella?
I will actually stick around for a few more minutes to answer some last-minute questions in the questions box. And also a recording of this will be sent out in an email in the next 24 to 48 hours. Thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you all in the next one.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.